Hello, welcome to what will hopefully be the last video in this series building up to the London Naval Conference and Treaty of 1930, looking at the outcome and consequences. I've done this in preparation for working with Alex Clarke on a sort of shared content, and all I can really do is recommend that you go and find Dr. Clarke on YouTube, Twitter, podcast server provider of your choice, unless you're part of the iCult, in which case you're probably stuck with Apple Podcasts, Discord, and Patreon. To quickly run through the key parts of the treaty itself, Part 1 covered capital ships and aircraft carriers, continuing on from the Washington Naval Treaty. Article 1 continued the holiday on building new capital ships until the end of the Washington Naval Treaty's term, although France and Italy retained the power or ability to build new capital ships as they had before without being in breach of the treaty. Article 2 covered the disposal of some of the oldest of the capital ships in the Royal Navy, US Navy, and Imperial Japanese Navy inventories, although the Japanese, having a smaller pool to draw on, actually it was one of the Congo class, and what they really did was to put it out of commission. They then actually recommissioned the ship Hiei, I think it was, in 1936 to 1940, but it took a lot of doing because they were fairly thorough when they described and defined how to decommission or dispose of a ship. Articles 3, 4 and 5 redefined what an aircraft carrier was, which broadly speaking was just there to close the loophole on smaller aircraft carriers of less than 10,000 tons standard displacement not being counted against a country's allocation of aircraft carriers. Coming to Part 2, Articles 6 and 7 add submarines to the lists of vessels that are kind of limited and constrained by the treaty system, saying that with the exception of a few already built or building vessels, submarines are now going to be limited to 2,000 tons standard displacement, which is a defined characteristic in the detail, and they're also limited to nothing more than a 5.1 inch or 130mm gun. Article 8 creates an excluded category. This is where Dr. Clarke's lovely sloops all come in. These are essentially diddy little vessels of 600 tons standard displacement or less, which were not seen as an offensive threat because they were felt to lack the range to undertake offensive operations. They were really seen as small torpedo boat type things. Vessels between 600 tons standard displacement and 2,000 tons standard displacement, which didn't have any of a list of things, this is essentially the sloops or avisos and the like, were excluded, and naval vessels that weren't warships were also excluded. So that's troop transports, fuel tankers, things like that. They aren't classed as warships. Then Part 3 only applied to the US, British Empire, and Empire of Japan. That comprised adding cruisers, destroyers, and submarines to the arms limitations, and also created definitions of these that they were going to all agree to and sign up to, for good or ill, perhaps. The destroyers were defined as being anything up to 1,850 tons standard displacement, with guns of up to 5.1 inch caliber. Anything bigger than that was classified as a cruiser. Now, cruisers were anything between 1,000 850 tons standard displacement, and 10,000 tons standard displacement, because if they went over the 10,000 tons, then they were a capital ship, unless they were an aircraft carrier. Also, anything with guns of more than 5.1 inch caliber was also automatically a cruiser, unless it fell into one of the other categories. Yeah, this is where we get the idea of light cruisers and heavy cruisers, which are officially actually just called subcategories A and B. Category A have guns between 6.1 inches and 8 inches, and Category B have 6.1 inch or below. As I've said, 6.1 inches is 155 millimeters, in the same way that 5.1 inches is 130 millimeters. This is because some of the powers involved used metric, some used imperial, some used both, and Britain would also sometimes break out things like 6-pounders just to really confuse everybody. But that's by the by. Additionally, this being only applying to the US, British Empire, and Empire of Japan, there were also limitations with a bit of jockeying around between heavy cruisers, light cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. The Japanese Navy was limited to only 60% of the other two navies in terms of heavy cruisers, 70% light cruisers and destroyers, and they were allowed up to 100% for submarines. As I think I've said before, albeit in another video, this isn't hugely helpful for the Japanese because their goal had been at least 70,000 tons standard displacement of submarines. They had been intending to look to outbuild the Americans with heavy cruisers, and they had also been looking at building destroyers almost exclusively in the kind of 1,850 ton range. So at the time of this treaty being signed or becoming effective, that made up about 40%, 40, of their total destroyer tonnage, yet they were actually limited to that only being 16%. The rest, 84%, should have been 1,500 tons or less. So then we come back to things which apply to everyone. Part 4 is a single article. This essentially confirms and outlaws unrestricted submarine warfare. This really wasn't at the time apparently seen as a controversial issue at all. Germany's behaviour in the kind of latter stages of World War I being seen as completely egregious. Essentially what this said was that the submarines were treated exactly the same as surface ships, and a warship would have to show that either a merchant vessel had shown a persistent refusal to stop, or had offered active resistance to boarding and searching before they could be sunk or made so that they, don't work anymore in some way. And place of safety wasn't just lifeboats. It depended on lots of things about how near you were to land, whether somebody else was going to come and pick them up, things like that. This was the part that was more widely promulgated and entered into kind of permanent international law. It didn't have an expiry, whereas, as you'll see in part 5, everything except that part is going to expire at the end of the Washington Naval Treaty expiry, which is the 31st of December 1936, or 1st of January 1937. There's also an agreement to hold another conference in 1935 to create a replacement treaty for the Washington Naval Treaty, of which this is really just a modification. So, what are the effects? It maintains the status quo. It avoids another arms race that no one could really afford, and probably no one wanted, except maybe the Japanese. Britain and the British Empire gave up on their dream of having about 70 cruisers. Just to make a point about the confusion about Britain and British Empire at this stage, the way that the treaty was signed was on behalf of the United Kingdom and parts of the British Empire, not separate members of the League of Nations, which was Australia, Canada, the Irish Free State, New Zealand, and South Africa and India. I'm not quite sure what happened to Newfoundland. I thought they were a separate dominion, but never mind. Yeah, so Britain, British Empire, gave up on the plan for having 70 cruisers. The US were forced to develop these terrible things like the Brooklyn-class cruisers that were in no way absolutely frickin' amazing. And on a more negative note, it really did block the Japanese really quite explicitly on a number of fronts where they had been aiming to overcome the quantitative limitations they had placed on them in terms of capital ships and aircraft carriers. That really was unhelpful. It, I think, helped to further disconnect the Japanese from any sort of sense of being part of or included within an international community who wanted peace, and sort of that move. It also furthered the divisions in Japan, and Japan had actually had a relatively liberal and democratic government in the early part of the 20th century, and things like the London Naval Treaty and what they'd agreed to actually helped to worsen divisions between the democratic, we want peace side, which was mostly not military, and the kind of military nationalistic side. So it wasn't good in that sense. A bit more on what I think the consequences are. It stopped naval development from going crazy, which I kind of described possibly a bit in the what ifs, counterfactuals. It did constrain the Japanese to some extent. It would be a few years later that they would barely be offering lip service to actually the treaty system. It did limit the Royal Navy and the US Navy, but at the same time they were really quite constrained politically as well, which at this sort of point, you had the Wall Street crash of 1929, that did bad things to everyone. Britain had been in a dodgy position for a little while already financially, and was initially under a Labour government, and then got some sort of strange government of national unity that I don't entirely understand, that had a Labour Prime Minister, but he was actually disliked by most of the Labour Party of the time, apparently, who really didn't support him and mostly kind of left his government, so he was being propped up by other groups. So, yeah. What would have happened without the London Naval Treaty? Really, I don't know. I don't know what would have happened to the balance of power between the Japanese, British Empire, and Dominions, Commonwealth, goodness knows what's best to call it, Navy and US Navy, and or the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine as it would become. You also, the politics of this era are also, really deteriorating. So, as I've said, Japan's democratic government at the early part of the 20th century is really losing its grip. France is suffering from standard French interwar politics. So, during the negotiation of the London Treaty or London Conference, in sort of January to April of 1930, the French Prime Minister actually gets ousted for a week, as you do. Italy had been under Mussolini for 7-8 years, which I'm sure is wonderful. China was a mess. Admittedly, the Japanese hadn't yet invaded Manchuria, but it was a civil war-ridden mess. Huge amounts of potential, but very glad I don't live there. You had the USSR, which was, not good. And of course, Germany is going in directions none of us really like. So, do I think the London Naval Treaty of 1930 was effective or ineffective? Well, I don't know. Isn't that helpful? To be slightly more helpful, if it's viewed as a limited scope arms limitation treaty, then I think it did reasonably. It held people back, it held the different powers back from kind of going overboard, from having rising tensions, and that sense of I'm not going to be in a more powerful position than I'm in now, so I might as well strike now, that I think the Japanese found themselves in late 1941 in real life, and in about sort of 37 or 38, by my reckoning, in my counterfactual or alternate history, which was about as far as I could get with it, without being wedded to one idea or not. If you view it as part of a wider arms limitation, war preventing interventions type thing, not so much, but I think that's because those were really starting to fail by about 1930. Equally, and probably as a consequence of that, the subsequent conferences were worse. You had a Geneva Convention, the World Disarmament Conference, from 1932 to 1934, actually continuously, that was a complete failure, with various people walking out, and certainly coming to no sort of agreement. And you had the London Naval Conference of 1935, which led to the Second London Naval Treaty of 1936. So it was held between December 35 and March 36, which I think was almost worse than being a complete failure, in that the only people who really got, the only side that really got bound up by that was the Royal Navy. In Italy, Japan didn't bother really showing up. And with hindsight, I just think the writing was on the wall at that point, and that was during the conference. Japan walked out. Italy declined to sign because people were trying to tell them off for aggressively invading Ethiopia, and Britain had already felt the need to form a separate treaty with Germany in 1935 without discussing it with France or any of their allies, which was really not good. So in a lot of ways, I think it was good. If it hadn't happened, it might have meant that Japanese democratic government that would sort of seek peaceful outcomes from things might have survived, and you might not have had the invasion of Manchuria and then the Sino-Japanese War and all the other Japanese aggression. That might have been limited. It might have been held back just long enough to not rise in the way that it did. I don't know. but equally, I think a lot of other things were a lot worse. And, I think whilst the 1930 treaty was good and it expanded, I think it was too pointedly aimed at Japan, and I think it was better than the stuff that came next. So, yeah, thank you very much for listening.